this is Tom from VermiBag. I'm going to do a quick update on the VermiBag Totes that I have running right now. So this top one is actually the one that we did the harvest on last week, and then we added some new material in there. I added a little bit of food into it. So it's been sitting for a week, going through a little bit of food and then a whole lot of new bedding in the system. The other two systems are the ones I did the update on last week, and I didn't do a feeding on the video last week, but the day after that I pulled some out of the freezer and I gave both the VermiBag Tote that's in the tub and the one that's in the stand. I gave both of them a really heavy feeding. So we'll take a look at those two and see how they're processing all that food, and then take a look at the one that we harvested last week and see how it's doing with all that new bedding. So let me zoom in a little bit closer and we'll take a look at the harvested bag. Okay, so here's the VermiBag Tote we harvested last week and we reset the system. So again, this has been going a whole week with just bedding. And I did throw, like I said, a little sweet potato in there yesterday. Let's take a look and see how they're doing in here. You can see the sweet potato right there in the center. And underneath it, you know, probably not long enough to get a big congregation of worms. There's definitely some worms coming up underneath it. A lot of little beetles and different things on it. But so we'll set that off on the side. And the first thing you notice is, compare this to last week. This, when we started a week ago. First thing I noticed right off the bat is that you're starting to see a lot of dark areas in this material. When we first reset it, it was just pure bedding, so it had a lot of white paper in it and stuff, so there's not much dark areas. Dig down into the bottom and see what it's like. Now amazingly, look at the bottom of that already. After just 1 week, they have basically processed a big chunk of the bottom section of this. Fairly finished castings down at the bottom. Take a look at this. Same thing here. Let me go ahead and zoom in just a little bit more. I mean, they are really working through this material. And this is just bedding. I'm kind of amazed again how fast they have been working through this material. The bottom section of this bag is actually well on its way of being composted. A little bit of that feeding from last week. Very bottom of the bag, the material is definitely a little on the moist side for sure. But I don't see any moisture dripping out of the bag whatsoever. So you can see how thick the worms are in this bag. I mean, there has to be pretty close to 2 pounds. So the worms look really good. There's a little bit of food left from last week, but not much. The worms are working through this material super fast. I'm kind of amazed at how quickly they're going through it. I mean, this really doesn't look like bedding anymore that I put in just a week ago. It looks like compost well on its way to being finished. So I'm going to go ahead and get some food, and we're going to feed this thing up pretty good and add just a little bit of bedding over the top to cover everything up. Okay, so I got a good mixture of frozen food to put in here. So I'm going to, there's some eggplant, some broccoli, paper towels, banana peel, peppers, cucumbers. I'm actually going to go pretty heavy on this thing. Like that. Then I'll get some bedding and cover it up. Go ahead and add bedding on top of this whole thing. Cover up this heavy feeding. Okay, that one's good to go. We'll take a look at it next week. Move it off to the side. Let's open up this one and see what it looks like. Again, this had a heavy feeding last week. I put a lot of food into this thing. Pretty similar to what I just did on the one that I harvested last week. That's interesting. I'm not sure what that is. Those little worms on there, I don't think they're... A lot of beetles. Just not sure if they're actually worms or potworms. It's hard to tell. Anyway, let's dig down in here. See the remnants of this feeding. The worms are... Quite a few worms in the center section now where they weren't. Again, the one thing I am noticing is the worms are getting a lot bigger. Now this center section, I mean it's fine, it's moist, but it could be moister, definitely. So I'm going to have to add a little bit of moisture or put quite a bit of the feeding that I'm going to do into the center section and stuff because it feels a little bit drier than I want it to be. But overall it looks pretty good there too. Let's take a look at the side. Yeah, I mean they're working through the material really well. Heavy feeding, and I'm going to say there's not a heck of a lot left. Some of those celery stalks, some skins here. So, and even some of these stalks are working on pretty good. Yeah. Now, not much food. So I'm going to do two things on this one. I am going to go ahead and give it a heavy feeding again, and then I'm probably going to water it down just a smidgen too. You know, I'm learning these systems too, and this is the one that's in the stand, so there's definitely a lot more airflow around it versus the one that's in the Rubbermaid tub. So let me grab some food, feed this thing up, and we'll water it down. So it's kind of the same thing that I put in the bag we harvested. These are just kitchen scraps that come out of the garbage can we have set up for recycling upstairs. And so sometimes I'll slice things up just slightly, but for the most part, it's how it comes out now. I do throw all my paper towels in there too. And there's no reason you can't throw these paper towels in. I mean, I highly recommend doing it. You have a lot of them that are generated in your kitchen. So then just let's add a little bit of compost or bedding over the top of that thing. One more. Now I am going to give this thing, just even though that bedding is soaking wet, I'm going to go ahead and give this one just a little bit of a spray down. And this bedding I'm putting in there is super wet. I just made it up. I'll do a video on how to make some bedding up quickly and run out versus making the giant batches like I normally make. And that's about it. I'm going to go ahead and put the burlap back over the top. And zip this bad boy up. Okay, let's take a look at the one that's in the tote. Okay, this is the tote that's inside the Rubbermaid bin. Let's take a look at that and see how this one's doing. And again, the interesting thing is this one tends to have condensation every time when I open it up. So I think it probably has to do with it being in the rubber tub, that it's actually not able to evaporate quite as much moisture because there's not as much airflow in and around the bag since it's contained inside this tub. Whereas the one that's in the wooden stand, I mean, it has airflow completely around it. So that could be a good thing. I don't know. Depends how wet you want to run your systems, but the worms like systems that are wet. The only disadvantage to having a wet system is if you want to sift your castings. But if you're not going to sift your castings, then go ahead and run your system a little bit wetter. The worms actually like it a little bit better. So let's dig down on this one and see what it looks like. Again, the material in here is really getting worked over well. I see some celery stalks, looks like, or broccoli stalks, remnants of the last feeding I did. Some skins of something. Overall, the moisture on this is definitely, it's moister than the one that's in the stand for sure. The worms look good. And same thing I noted on the other one. I noticed the worms are getting a lot bigger in this one now. There's actually some pretty good sized worms. And I didn't start out with too many worms in either one of these other totes. The one that I did the harvest on, that one I did. I started out with a lot of worms in that. And you can tell how fast it's blowing through the material. So, yeah, I mean, it looks really good. Moisture content on this is actually really good. I definitely won't add any moisture to this other than the feeding. So let me do the same thing on this one. Give it a feeding and we'll set it up for another week. Okay, let's go ahead and load this side down with some food too. Again, this is another heavy feeding. The worms seem to be handling it pretty good, so I'm just going to continue to add these. This I'll have to try and come back. It's a plum and bust it open, otherwise the worms will never get into it. But okay, let me add some bedding to this. Go ahead and put the burlap back over the top. Actually, I'm going to throw this paper sack that I have in there as well. And again, it really is interesting that I got condensation on this one, but I don't have it on the one that's in the stand. So the only difference between the systems really, one has the dividers, the other one doesn't, but that's not going to make any difference. So really the only difference is the fact that one is in the wooden stand and this one is in a Rubbermaid tote. So I think it's holding the moisture better than the one in the stand. So that's it. That's this week's update on the VermiBag Totes. I think I will be starting one more of them up, so I'll have 4 of them that I'm going to be running. They each got a really big feeding. The worms are doing great in them, and I'm just kind of curious on some of the differences between the stand and the tub type systems on how they're operating on moisture. So it'll be interesting to follow that over the next couple of weeks. So that's it. This is Tom from VermiBag. Till next week, ciao.